So what makes a good game? Different people are gonna have different criteria, that's just common sense. That said, there are some common elements that will likely get mentioned when discussing games, even if the weight people put on them may vary. I myself have my own standards for judging a title, and I'm sure as I've done my reviews, it's been questioned why I've seemed to focus on some that many may think are unimportant. So for clarity's sake, and to open up discussion, I've decided to compile a list of what I look for in a game and put them in order of relative importance. It can vary a bit though if a title manages to do one of them well enough to transcend the others. So I'm Wes, the Explosion, and here's what games can focus on to make me happy. To me, gameplay is king. Does it do something interesting and new? Does it just do something I already love really well? Or better yet, does it put a twist on one of my favorite series or genres, giving me more of what I like while keeping things fresh? And is it all easy to pick up, the controls intuitive and the basic systems well explained, without needing to read through a ton of dry text for extended periods of time? Are there subtle little moves and details that you'll pick up naturally the more you play? Does it all flow smoothly, without me needing to constantly look up guides? Are the different levels challenging and engaging? Will it give me a sense of immersion and cause me to lose track of time? Gameplay is kind of a catch-all term, and honestly, a lot of the other stuff we'll be discussing probably could be shoehorned into this category, but maybe when discussing video games, everything being able to fit into gameplay should be expected. Maybe there's a simpler way I can put this. When I'm playing a game, is it fun? I joke all the time that video games aren't about fun, and to a degree, that is true when you're streaming or making game content. I'm planning on playing Bale in Wonderworld sometime in the future, and that will have nothing to do with fun, just letting people amuse themselves by watching me suffer. But for the average player, video games are leisure activity, and like Reggie Fils-Aimé once said, if it isn't fun, why bother? If a game is enjoyable to play, everything else can be crap. The game can still be good. That said, the next topic, which is sort of a subcategory of gameplay, is perhaps the only thing that can override this. This is something I typically don't even consider, unless they're really bad, and that's how the game controls, how you're directly engaging with the gameplay. The biggest examples tend to be when a game forces in a hardware gimmick to the control scheme, to make it nigh unplayable. Nintendo, I'm looking at you. Star Fox 64 is a magnificent game, one of the best for the N64, that I'd say really only Assault for the GameCube even got kind of close to matching. Star Fox Zero tries to be an advanced remake of the title, having a lot of the same story beats, characters, mechanics, and similar missions, yet it remains an infamous title due to just how unfun it was to control, you needing to divide your attention between the TV for third-person view and the gamepad for first-person aiming. While I've certainly made worse financial decisions, picking this title up is one of my biggest sources of buyer's remorse in my life, just on principle. They had Miyamoto promoting this thing for goodness sake. Similarly, one of the games I keep wanting a remake of is Kid Icarus Uprising. I hear amazing things about it, yet the one big caveat that always gets brought up is its nightmare of a control scheme. When it's described, it reminds me of Metroid Prime Hunters, where you had to use the D-pad for movement, touchscreen to aim, and buttons to do actions. While I beat it, the game gave me major hand pain for days afterwards, and some of the paint was even rubbed off my DS from the awkward way I was forced to hold it. While some call Uprising Sakurai's greatest work, I contend that no game, no matter how much it nails everything else, if it hurts the control, it can't be considered good. Thus my desire for a port, with altered controls. Even if it isn't that bad though, it can still drag the experience down. A lot of early 3D games are a little awkward to maneuver, just because people were still trying to figure out the extra D. While Mario 64 handled it better than most, I don't think it even compares to Galaxy. Similarly, about the only Mega Man series that I never got super into was Legends. While the characters are charming, the writing interesting, and the design's good, I never really got the controls down pat. While I don't dislike Legends, this always stopped me from being in love with it. I managed to beat the final boss in the first game through sheer stubbornness, and Legends 2 is the only mainline Mega Man game that I haven't cleared. Was really hoping that with the years of experience under Capcom's belt, Legends 3 would finally have a control scheme that would click with me, but we all know how that turned out. Anyway, if the controls are good, the game will feel good, but for the most part, as long as they're passable, I tend not to notice it too much. When they're downright awful though, it can completely ruin the entire experience and nothing, in my opinion, will be able to save it. I put an odd amount of importance on narrative, to the point where, if you count controls as a subsection of gameplay, this is actually second on my list. This is a big enough deal to me that I might actually give it its own video at some point, so I'll try to keep it brief to avoid repeating myself too much. First off, it gives context to what's happening in the game. Not every title needs this, just look at the original Mario or puzzle games like Tetris, but it is nice to know why you're doing what you're doing. It also gets you invested in things. Maybe there's a character you like, maybe you're curious about the world, maybe you want to see how much you can predict, heck, maybe you just want to know what happens next in general. Fire Emblem is a master at this, not only having grand plots, but getting you attached to specific characters to the point where you'll be willing to reset an hour of progress just to make sure they don't die. Of course, all this needs to be appropriate for what the game is going for. An action platformer shouldn't take you a half hour just to watch through the opening cutscene, and a massive RPG probably shouldn't be too stingy with their lore and world building. Still though, if they do a good job with the game's story, it can make up for a lot of horrible in other areas. I love to read, I even did a few book reviews on the channel way back, so a good narrative can get me to play something I would normally skip over. Doki Doki Literature Club is one of my favorite games, despite having very little in the way of gameplay. Its writing managed to grab me that much. And while Mega Man Zero's story always gets me fired up to take out the final boss in 4, Metroid Other M's takes me out of it, me not minding the gameplay as much as I do the incredibly clumsy storytelling. Okay, the gameplay got me sometimes too. And the controls. You know what? That game might have been a mistake. Replay is something that adds a lot of value to a game, beyond just its basic promise. Sure, you can just work on getting those credits and call it a day, but giving you a reason to go back to it, be it getting stuff you miss, having different options like other characters, builds, or story paths to try out, going for a personal best time, or it just being really freaking good, so that one clear just doesn't feel like enough, are all ways to add replay value. I have around 150 games on my backlog. Part of the problem is that there are some that I've already gotten to that I just want to play through again. Because I tend to talk about titles that I've already played several times, I typically don't mention replay value in my reviews, just because I feel like it goes without saying. Games like Mega Man were meant to be played over and over and over again. That said, this one can be a bit at odds with the narrative element. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of RPGs that I played multiple times. If I leave enough time between rounds, I forget some plot points and I'll notice things I didn't before, like foreshadowing that went over my head, which is pretty cool. When it comes to mystery games like Phoenix Wright and Danganronpa though, it's a little harder to justify a revisit. Once you find out who the murderer is, no matter how long it's been since you played it and how many things fade from memory, you never really forget who done it. Luckily, both series are good enough that the first playthrough will be worth it, but it's a shame that they're largely one and dones. If only I could get targeted, on-demand amnesia. So while replay value is something I put a lot of importance on, look at how many times I played through X4 just on the streaming channel, it's not an absolute requirement. If it's not going to be on the table though, it does need to be pretty damn good to counterbalance it. Good music isn't something a game needs, but it sure is nice when it's there. Like, I enjoy vanilla ice cream, but I like it even more when it has some peanut butter or caramel or cookie bits mixed in, you know? Sometimes I do wonder though, do I only enjoy a soundtrack as much as I do because I associate it with a certain game? How much is causation? How much is correlation? For a while, I questioned whether I only liked the NES Mega Man OSTs because of how much I love the games, but Mega Man X6 kinda disproves this. I hate X6 more than anything, and if I was given a time machine I could use to prevent just one tragedy, I wouldn't be going back to prevent a war. Yet I'd rank its soundtrack as one of the best in the franchise. That's not to say that being paired with a great game doesn't add to the weight of a track, but I think it's one of those things where one enhances the other. A great game is made greater by a great soundtrack, and likewise, you enjoy a song more when you have a strong, positive association with it, such as a video game stage with a cool gimmick. While I wouldn't ever bash a game based solely on its OST, it can certainly net it some bonus points. In a similar vein, good sound effects and voice acting can also enhance a playthrough. Music's just what I tend to pay more attention to when it comes to sound design. It doesn't take much to please me when it comes to graphics. That's probably obvious with some of the games that I've said look nice in the past. I'm the type to think that pixels are timeless, and my eyes aren't sharp enough to notice when some big graphical advancement is made to make the games look the slightest bit more realistic. On the contrary, I tend to like more cartoony or retro stuff, so normally when I end up talking about a game's visuals, I keep things pretty brief. Of course, there are two situations where I do take notice, and in a bad way. I don't really like the aesthetic of old 3D, with all the polygons. Think N64 and PS1 stuff. Much like with controls, this is another area where I think early 3D aged really poorly. If you want something to look realistic, scary, heck, maybe even sexy, while that era did the best they could, it only worked because we had nothing to really compare it to back then. I think it tends to work better if the realism is instead supplanted with style, though. I played Maverick Hunter X on the PSP several months back, and while you can definitely see a lot of polygons, since the characters are robots and early model Reploids to boot, all the extra edges kind of work. And likewise, the right style can even make a game timeless. Already used that word when it came to 8, 16, and 32-bit, but there's some more modern games where it works too. Take pretty much every game Vanillaware puts out, with sprites that look like paintings in motion. The visuals they establish with Odin Sphere are so distinct that when the trailer for Unicorn Overlord popped up in a Nintendo Direct, I instantly questioned whether they were behind it. They were. Then you have titles like The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker and Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, which have a style that fits perfectly within the GameCube's hardware limitations while still looking great. When Nintendo announces remakes with up graphics, you have to question why, since a straight port would still be acceptable on modern consoles. Yes, both of them look better now, but I still wonder how and why. I very much prefer these sorts of stylish graphics over high-definition ones that will all be complaining are outdated in a matter of years. The other issue is when the game runs poorly, giving us graphical bugs like choppy animations or poppin'. Heck, maybe this should be more of a judgment on whether a game's technically impressive or not, since it can cause other issues like slowdown or other glitches. While I've worked around bugs before if the game was holding my attention in other ways, there have been some titles that I've dropped because it was pretty much unplayable. So while I don't care all that much about frames per second, graphical fidelity, and the like, an ugly enough game will still make me raise an eyebrow, and a buggy enough mess will cause me to throw it in the trash. Length is one of those things that I don't think is nearly as important as most people seem to think it is. Heck, with me, it's almost a detriment. My brother loves RPGs, and he's constantly bugging me to play Fire Emblem Echoes and Persona 5, both games that I'm sure I'll love, but whenever I look at the runtimes, I think about how many smaller games I could get through instead. And then just replace something I've already beaten. That kinda brings us back to the whole replay subject again, me much preferring shorter games that I can knock out in an afternoon to blow off some steam, rather than something I know I'll be playing for weeks or months. Guess I have a commitment problem, which is probably why I'm not married. Yup, that and absolutely no other reason. And to a lesser degree, I sometimes also get drawn into games with no fixed endpoint, that you can just kinda play for shorter stints, for however long you want. Stuff like Animal Crossing, grinding levels in post-game Pokemon, or some roguelites, like 20XX or One Step from Eden. Like I tell my brother, I'll play the massive stuff when I retire, all the while ironically getting enough time in with the small stuff to complete several of the big boys. All that said, length is something you might want to consider when talking about price. While this doesn't affect whether a game is good or not, whether it's worth the cost of admission is another thing entirely. I think a lot of people have some pretty ridiculous dollar-to-hour ratios, but at the same time, I know not everyone can afford to buy games all willy-nilly, and if you're on a fixed budget, it's going to be pretty disappointing if you shell out $60 and you're done with it in a few hours. While I've been pretty flippant about this sort of thing in the past, saying that the solution for Metroid Dread only taking around 10 hours to beat being to play it multiple times, I do understand why it's important to a lot of people. I just think most folks need to lower their standards. And publishers shouldn't think it's a rule to charge $60 or $70 if the game's smaller in scale. I can accept the wide range of difficulty, though I do like knowing about what to expect when I'm starting up a game. There are times when I do really want to challenge myself. There are also times when I just want to relax with the game. And there are others where I want to feel like a god and just wipe out all my in-game opposition with the mere flick of a hand. That said, swinging too far in either direction can be a turnoff. When it comes to hard titles, it's more of the artificial stuff that gets me. Inflating enemy health bars, making you die too easily, or puzzles that are basically impossible to figure out without either looking up a solution or just throwing everything at the wall until you stumble upon it. Some of this you can mitigate with a guide or watching videos to learn special techniques, but if a game was either made impossibly hard to drag out the runtime, there's no sense of balance, or something was just programmed in poorly, making things harder than intended, it is going to bug me. Challenging but fair is the standard to shoot for with hard stuff. Likewise, if a game feels too simple and gameplay feels like a mere formality, I start losing interest. This too, though, can sometimes be fixed by adding extra restrictions on yourself. While Pokemon is pretty easy, being a kid's game and all, people do Nuzlocks, and while I myself don't go that far, I will do stuff like not use items or refuse the free swap outs, even if that means telling the game that I don't want to switch Pokemon, only to immediately do just that next turn. About the only time I can recall a game being too easy that I couldn't engage was with Kirby's Epic Yarn, and even then, that was probably a mistake since, yes, clearing the game was a foregone conclusion, but 100%ing everything likely would have taken some skill. Still though, I do know that challenge can be a make or break for some people, so I do try to mention it. So those are the basic things I look for in a game. Even if I don't mention replay and length in most reviews, it is something I consider on a personal level. And as for the other elements that I didn't mention, I either didn't think of them or consider them a non-issue, like realism. I care much more about whether a game's fun than having to constantly decide what items to drop because my pockets are too full. While only gameplay is a make or break for me, ideally, a game will have a mix of all these elements to create a truly memorable experience, but lacking in one or two categories typically won't sink it. Those are just my priorities though, and I'd love to hear what other people think. Is there anything big you think I ignored? And do you think I put too much or too little importance on anything? That'll do it for this week. Thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into Mega Man. For everlasting peace.